Hi, everybody. Welcome to our virtual salon today. My name is Caitlin Caligira. I'm the founder and president of A Tour of Her Own, and we are hosting this program today in partnership with Dumbarton House, historic home in Georgetown. I'm here today with Mary Lesher, who will be representing Dumbarton House and telling us all about the work that they do. And I'm also here with my good friend and colleague, Rebecca Grawl, who is vice president of A Tour of Her Own and my co-author for our book 111 Places in Women's History That You Must Not Miss in Washington, D.C. So we're super excited to be with you today. I want to just kind of just lay out some stuff about what you can expect in this session before we get deep into some stories. So first of all, this program is being recorded. So if anyone out there is watching the recording, thank you for signing up. And for the folks that are watching live, welcome. We encourage you to use the chat box. This really gives you a good opportunity to engage with us, ask questions in real time, help ask for clarity, things like that. Now, Dumbarton House has been an awesome partner to A Tour of Her Own for several years now. We just absolutely love working with them on all kinds of programs, from tours to panels and everything in between. And one of the really great things that Dumbarton does and is known for is for their work in preservation, historic preservation and archiving and things along those lines. They're in the center of Georgetown, and so full of information and history. Now, when Becca and I were writing our book, we would come together and kind of share some analysis that we were picking up on. And one of the things that we just kept saying to ourselves was like, whoa, like women are so in preservation. It was just really common that we were finding that there were stories behind the stories, like women that were behind preserving buildings, or often intergenerational stories of women preserving their grandmother's legacy, for instance. So I think it's important, to understand how we even talk about preservation, and we'll go into that. But that's sort of how this program came to be today. With that, I just really love to pass this on to Mary, so she can tell us a little bit more about Dumbarton House, a little bit more about preservation, and also about the National Society Colonial Dames of America, which is headquartered out of the historic home. So Mary, go ahead, let us know what it's all about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Caitlin. It's lovely to be here with everybody. So Dumbarton House, as Caitlin said, is the headquarters of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America, which is a women's organization that has a three-pronged mission, which includes historic preservation, patriotic service, and history education. So they're doing a lot of different things, both here in DC and across the country. It is an organization that is federated. So we have societies in each state, and we own, through all of those societies, 90 properties that we either run ourselves, that we help maintain, or that we support. And so we're very deep into the historic preservation world. Dumbarton House itself is in Georgetown. It was built in 1799, and its first long-term occupant was a guy named Joseph Nurse, who was one of the first civil servants. He worked in the Treasury Department for the first 6 presidents. And at that museum, we try to tell the story of early Washington and what it was like in the federal city for people at all levels, whether you're a civil servant, top 5% of wealth earners in the country at that time, or you're one of the individuals that they enslaved to maintain their urban plantation. And we really want to run the gamut of what life was like when the city was first founded, and give people kind of an insight into what it was like there. So that's a little bit about Dumbarton House and the NSCDA. Caitlin asked me to speak a little bit about preservation and what it means. And I think it's changed a lot over time. So of course, when organizations like the NSCDA or the Mount Vernon Ladies Association were founded, preserving our historic places was really one of the only ways for women to be involved in the process of governing and identity making and being patriotic, really. And so now that women don't have to only, preserve old buildings to have a say in what's happening in our country, we can change a little bit what we're doing and speak new narratives and try new things. So for me, preservation can mean anything from making sure that a house doesn't fall down or isn't torn down, to listening to the stories of our neighbors at Dumbarton House and learning more about their experience with our museum, with the neighborhood, with each other. And I mean, it can be a piece of paper, or it can be a memory. All of those things should be preserved. And that's kind of where I move in my work in the historic preservation field.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Some like really interesting points that you brought up, like how preservation is about new ideas, and it feels almost contradictory, like, oh, you're preserving history, but we see so often that giving that new narrative really brings those stories into the present in a way that maybe they're more relatable, or a way that they fit into current events. And so it's so important to draw that, or draw that bridge and put the two together. The other really interesting thing you said, which I had never thought about, was about how the dames own real estate. This was another theme. And the more I think about it, and the more I think about cities at large, owning real estate is major. It's ownership. It's having representation in several places. And when you think about, having a presence like that, it really is important. So that's like kind of new information for me that I'll be thinking about. So thank you for sharing that. So like Mary said, anything from preserving a house to preserving a memory. And I love the broadness of this. And with that, I want to give Rebecca a chance to chat, because Rebecca is super, super knowledgeable about the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is separate from the colonial dames, but both groups are sort of lineage groups, and they do similar kinds of work. And so we heard about the dames. I really want Becca to just enlighten us on some of the work that the DAR are doing here in Washington, D.C. So Becca, go for it.
Thanks, Caitlin. Well, hello to everybody. In addition to being a professional tour guide and a guidebook author, I am a member of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm a 3-generation member. So my mother and my grandmother members, my sister's a member. This is just something that we've done for a really long time. For the uninitiated, the DAR is founded in 1890, primarily because women are denied entry to join the Sons of the American Revolution, a lineage organization for those descended from those that fought in the revolution. And I love what Mary said about preservation as a venue for patriotism, that because so many of these groups and organizations that were founded right after the founding of our nation denied entry to women, there wasn't that traditional sort of venue to say, I'm a patriot and I love my country. So DAR is very much founded in that vein. What I love is one of our 4 founders who we highlight in the book. We have a beautiful founders memorial in DC at the DAR headquarters, sculpted by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. One of our 4 founders wrote an op-ed to the Washington Post as they were percolating this idea. And she basically asked, were there no mothers of the revolution? And I love that, because that's sort of a big question about preservation. There's our beautiful founders memorial. It's so tough with the blur on Zoom.
I know.
I love the blur, but I love that idea. And I think that's so much of what we're doing in a preservation space in a more contemporary time, is saying, where were the mothers? Where were other narratives? Where are the other stories when we talk about our founding, when we talk about our nation's history? So DAR, from its beginning, has been very rooted in historic preservation. My guess is if you've been pretty much anywhere in the US and seen an old house or building, if you looked real closely, there's probably a DAR plaque or marker on it. And that's one of the things I love about DAR, is so much of the preservation is done at a real community level. It isn't necessarily just about preserving national landmarks. It's about making sure that your city, your town, your county's history, it remains, and that it's preserved. And a lot of that extends beyond physical space, in terms of like collecting oral histories or building archives, supporting genealogical libraries and archives all across the US. A good example of how that's been carried out in DC specifically is in the last administration. DAR works in kind of a 3-year administration. I don't know if how the colonial dames does it, but typically 2-year. Yeah, we work in a 3-year. In the District of Columbia, the state regent's project was for every DAR chapter in DC to adopt a call box. And for the uninitiated, if you've spent some time on the DC streets, you've definitely seen a call box. They were basically the early emergency services. If you needed a fire department, police department, you go to the local call box, which were cast iron structures on the corner, and that's how you could, send the alarm. There's a great example. We have a call box. And we have a specific call box chapter, but we mention call boxes frequently in the book. So a lot of these call boxes are obviously no longer used for emergency services. We all just dial 911 or send an alert on our phone. And so the city just has call boxes standing on these corners. And so DC DAR chapters each adopted one call box. The city has made it really easy for people to get involved with call box preservation. The city itself will take care of stripping off the old paint, basically priming it and getting it ready. And then individual groups like DAR can adopt a box and basically tell a historical story. And so that's what DAR focused on for the last 3 years in DC. And it's really phenomenal to be walking down kind of just a residential street, see a box and realize that there was a woman in medicine or a woman in the military or a woman who was doing local community-based work. And so it's a really great way to tell stories that might not otherwise ever be told. And I love that we're exploring preservation in spaces beyond just a historic house or something related to a president, although women were very involved in preserving those spaces too. But I love the community focused element.
Excellent. I want to make a few connections as you were talking. They were sort of popping into my head because I showed you the Four Founders statue that's outside DAR Constitution Hall in DC, just a block away from the White House. But you mentioned Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and that made me think of another sculpture that she has in Washington, DC, the Titanic Memorial. And this was spearheaded by the women of America, and particularly First Lady Helen Taft. And again, we're preserving the memory of the people who perished on the Titanic. And then that kind of took me down the rabbit hole of Helen Taft's legacy as First Lady, and her also preserving or really bringing the cherry blossom trees to Washington, D.C. Everybody talks about the cherry blossom trees, and few people know that it was mostly First Lady Taft and Eliza Skidmore who were leading the campaign. So again, it's the women behind these, and those aren't buildings, they're sculptures, they're trees, they're nature, which is also very, I think, feminine forward a lot of the time. But I want to move a little bit off the DAR and come to a few specific sites that we can dive into. So Mary, I want to come back to you. I also want to show folks our chapter about Dumbarton House in the book. We have this beautiful, it's chapter 21 if you're following along, this beautiful Chinese porcelain, and it belonged to Martha Washington. So cool. I think this might have been one of my nerdiest moments in writing, not only writing the book, but we actually got to see it and take a picture of it. And I just thought wow, this is an awesome opportunity. And I think, I don't remember exactly when I wrote the Dumbarton House chapter, but I know it was a point when I was how am I going to write this chapter? And it definitely had to come from the preservation angle. I didn't want to write about Martha Washington. I didn't want to write about her granddaughter. I didn't want to write about the China. I mentioned it, but the focus is on how you all have preserved it. And that's what you do at large. So I want to bring it back to you to talk about your neighborhood and talk about, what it means to be in Georgetown and what it means to have relationships with other sites in the area, particularly some of the cemeteries, because I've recently come to some programs that you've done and they've been great. So if you could talk about some of those cemetery neighbors, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who don't know, Georgetown was here long before DC was established. It was originally part of Maryland. It was incorporated as a city in 1751, and it was the 30th largest port city in the world. So that seems pretty out of proportion given what it was, just a tiny little town on the Potomac, but they had a very vigorous trade, particularly in tobacco, then in wheat. And the last major trade item that came out of Georgetown was enslaved individuals, with chattel. And so because of its location, and its ability to move things both inland and across the ocean. It was a very desirable location. And when DC was established for the Compromise of 1790, having an already extant port city there made it much easier to then go ahead and build the rest of the federal city. And Georgetown, as a kind of community in the 1700s, 1800s, had a very large Black population and a very large free Black population. And so that really kind of changes the way people think about Georgetown when they know that it was a historically Black neighborhood. It's not today by any means, but 200 years ago, it was 30 to 45% Black, and today it's only 6% Black. And that's a drastic change over the course of a couple centuries. Yeah, and so Dumbarton House is right on the edge of a neighborhood called Herring Hill, and it was called Herring Hill because it is right next to the to Rock Creek, and so they would fish for herring. It's on a hill, and it's next to the river where they got Herring Hill. And this is a primarily Black neighborhood. The one interesting thing about urban slavery, as we think about it compared to plantation slavery, is that there's a lot more room for movement. You're going to be interacting with a lot of different people, even if you're enslaved on a particular plantation. Like if you were enslaved at Dumbarton House on the 8-acre urban farm that's producing all the food and the goods that the family needs, you're probably going to have to go into town. And to go into town, you're going to cross paths with other individuals who are in that neighborhood who maybe are free. Maybe it's an enslaved person married to a free person. And the ability to live with your partner in a house and commute to your job as an enslaved person each day is really different than what it would have been like in a rural slavery setting. And so that's one big difference that we like to think about. And because we are situated so close to this very big Black neighborhood in Georgetown, we are also close to a lot of really important parts of the Black community, including the first Black congregation in DC, the Mount Zion United Methodist Church, which is on 29th and Dumbarton, I believe, Northwest. And then their cemetery, which was the Mount Zion United Methodist Church cemetery and Female Union Band Society cemetery. And so basically, Mount Zion Church was started because the Black members of the congregation got fed up with the segregation that was happening. So they split off and they made their own church. Both the white and the Black Methodist churches continued to bury their deceased members in the same cemetery together, which is just across the street from Dumbarton House, until Oak Hill Cemetery was established. And then many of those white families had their loved ones disinterred and reinterred in the white-only Oak Hill Cemetery. And so Mount Zion Cemetery becomes one of the oldest Black cemeteries, the oldest Black cemetery in DC. And at the same time that the Methodist Church is burying their members there, they also sell a parcel of land adjacent to a gentleman who was representing the Female Union Band Society, which is a women's welfare organization that you paid into weekly. And in the event that you fell sick and you couldn't work, they would pay you $2 a week to get by. And when you passed away, they paid $20 for your burial. And so they had this cemetery that they had a lawyer buy it for them, but then it belonged to the women. They found a way to get a hold of the real estate. And people have been interred in those two cemeteries from 1808 up until the 1950s. And then, as happens with a lot of old cemeteries, there's no one keeping a close eye on it. There's no one specifically looking after it. And so it falls into disrepair. And it was very nearly purchased for development not that long ago. And that's the only reason that it's been saved, is because it almost was turned into condos. And the church and it's a very long, confusing name, but if you just Google blackgeorgetown.com, blackgeorgetown.org, you're going to do a lot better finding them. They have a lengthy name for their nonprofit, but they're working to preserve the cemetery. And the church is also working to preserve their structure. And we have women leaders at both the church and the cemetery who are doing incredible things to really save these important parts of Georgetown's past. And because we are neighbors, we always knew that there has to be some connection. the people who are enslaved or free who are working at Dumbarton House, they're members of this community. They're going to church, they're have families, they're having burials. We assume that there's some connection there, but for the very first time last year, we found an actual individual who we can tie to the Black Georgetown community who was enslaved at Dumbarton House. And her name is Grace Duckett. And she was enslaved at Dumbarton House from at least 1825 until 1862, when she was manumitted in her owner's will upon her death. And she then moved just down a block to P Street to live with her daughter. And when she passed away 8 years later, she was carried up the hill and interred at Mount Zion with her family. And her daughter's father-in-law was the first pastor at Mount Zion United Methodist Church. So we know that Grace was going to church with them. We know that she was going to the cemetery for various, rituals and burials. We know that she was a member of this community for a really long time. And we're working to dig up more about her so we can continue to strengthen our connections with these very important parts of the Black community in Georgetown.
Yeah, it's such a special place, and it's really a place to, I want to say visit, but like pay your respects to. When I came to the panel at Dumbarton a few weeks ago, a lot of the panelists, many of them women who are spearheading this, were talking about also the kind of like the energies and the spirit and the soul that also kind of lives within these spaces. And I think that that's so important to talk about as well from a preservation perspective, because that's not just a memory, it's an energy, and it has, just like, some people talk about ghosts in Georgetown, like sometimes there's negative energies, sometimes there's really positive ones too that help generations, heal or whatever it might be. So the Mount Zion Cemetery and Female Union Band Society Cemetery are totally so much part of not only Georgetown's history, but the city for sure. Yeah. And again, we come back to sort of like this idea of real estate. Women at that time, particularly Native and Black women, couldn't purchase land. And so they needed allies to help do that. And then, that again is just like sometimes such a barrier if you don't have it, or perhaps a major contribution if you do have that kind of land and opportunity. Well, thank you, Mary. Let's shift into out of Georgetown a little bit. Let's go to downtown DC. This is a virtual experience, but you guys can just imagine it in your head. You're on the bus, maybe on the metro, riding your bike through DC, and we come to the White House, one of the most iconic structures in the city. And, you could stand in front of the White House all day and really talk about so many stories and so much history. But what we're going to introduce you to is the preservation of Lafayette Park just outside the White House. And Becca, you want to share some information about a plaque and Jackie Kennedy's involvement in this. So go for it.
Sure. So just as a little context too, at a tour of our own, we have been running sort of women-focused history tours from our inception. And the very first tour I ever wrote and developed for Toho was on First Ladies. And I kind of initially was like, I could talk about Jackie. She's so iconic. Everybody already sort of has this image. And it's like, well, what do I talk about? I think a lot of people immediately think about her preservation efforts in the White House, which is very significant. She's going to be vital in establishing the White House Historical Association, naming the first White House curator, really thinking about the White House as a place that tells the story of America. But how many people, if they pick up a guidebook or are going on the average walking tour, get to go inside and see that preservation work? But as I was working on the tour, I wanted to include Jackie, but how? And it really sort of hit me spending time in Lafayette Square Park, where I'm at a lot to lead tours, because there was a somewhat small plaque. There's now a much more prominent one, really honoring Jackie's preservation efforts of the park itself. And if you go to Lafayette Square Park, or if you haven't in a while, next time you're there, take a moment to look at the buildings that aren't the White House, because there's two really significant homes, both of which are highlighted in the book, that have direct ties to really unique women. One is the Dolly Madison House. The other is the Decatur House, which is named for Commodore Stephen Decatur, who had it built, but where a woman, an enslaved woman named Charlotte Dupuis, is actually going to lodge a lawsuit basically to sue for her freedom. And she's not just going to sue anybody, she's going to sue the Secretary of State, Henry Clay. So she was enslaved to Henry Clay. She's going to take him to court in the District of Columbia. Ultimately, the court case won't be found in her favor, but it's a really important step in the legal fight when we're talking about who has rights and who has a right to be free. So when I think about Lafayette Square Park and I think about these houses and those stories, all of that was going to be raised. All of that was going to become office buildings to support the executive branch of the US government. And Jackie really took action, and she took action in a very Jackie way. I think that we sometimes tend to want to celebrate the women that are the loudest or the most out there, the ones that are in the streets. That wasn't necessarily Jackie Kennedy, but the work she did was no less significant. She basically set up a meeting with a man at the General Services Administration and basically implied that her husband wanted her to have this meeting, and really sort of overplayed the President Kennedy influence. But that was enough to get the meeting and stroll through the park and really start to maybe suggest that the president would love if they could somehow have the offices, but also keep the historic structures. And so Jackie is going to become really the driving force behind what we know as Lafayette Square Park today. And there was a plaque sort of, and it's still there on the edge of the park. And it's like, if you really stop to look by the Decatur House, you might notice it. But usually there's so many like beautiful flowers and other things going on, no one sees it. Well, they have just unveiled, like truly a few weeks ago, a really big circular plaque that has an image of Jackie Kennedy, and it's directly in front of the Decatur House. You cannot miss it. If you stop to look at this home, you will see her there. And it really acknowledges that history that we're taking in wouldn't exist without the work of this woman. And I think that that's so significant, because that history really does belong to all of us. And it's out there in a public space that anyone can access anytime. And so I just really love the plaque. I spent maybe 20 minutes a couple days ago trying to take the best pictures I could with like all the fall colors and everything, because it just looks really beautiful. So next time you're in the park, take some time to really notice the non-White House buildings that surround that area. And we talk about the preservation of the White House area, but she is also going to be sort of the driving force and the kind of kicker to start the preservation of Pennsylvania Avenue as a whole, because we think of Pennsylvania Avenue today as sort of this iconic it's America's main street, and we're so used to going down and seeing these big impressive buildings. But Pennsylvania Avenue did not look so great in the 1950s when Kennedy was coming down in his inaugural parade. He and Jackie were looking around going, what happened? This doesn't reflect the America we want. And so Jackie's preservation efforts go far beyond just the interior of the White House.
Yeah, Pennsylvania Avenue is just so iconic. It stretches, of course, to the White House. And yeah, I think that's always most interesting. People don't realize that these places didn't always look like this, and it took often intentional campaigns and advocacy to preserve them and to make them into the places that most people see when they come to DC. Jackie Kennedy, we're going to transition a little bit to a story I want to share about Ford's Theater. So John F. Kennedy is one of 4 presidents who have been assassinated. Another one, of course, is Abraham Lincoln, who I like to share that he didn't spend much time in the White House. It was a little bit traumatic. And he actually spent a lot of his time up in Lincoln's cottage, which I think is an exceptional place to visit. That's kind of a hidden gem, but I'm getting a little bit off topic. The place I want to talk about is Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln was shot and then later carried across the street where he died at the Peterson House. Now, after the president, is shot and dies, the theater kind of, for quite some time, it becomes like storage for the U.S. government. It's like a warehouse. Doesn't really have much function to it. But the story of preservation is one that when I found out, it was just so impressive. And it's about a woman named Frankie Hewitt. And Frankie Hewitt is responsible for bringing live performances back to Ford's Theater. And that came almost 100 years after Lincoln's assassination. Now, here's the connection that really is so kind of jaw-dropping. Frankie Hewitt was a speech writer for John F. Kennedy. And when he was assassinated, she was so kind of looking to do something of meaning that she turned to Ford's Theater and kind of felt connected to Abraham Lincoln's assassination and trying to heal and deal with John F. Kennedy. She looked to the theater and she saw it as this empty memorial to John Wilkes Booth, to his killer, to the man that shot Lincoln there and then basically took that energy out of it, right? Made it a bad place. And so Frankie Hewitt set out to make it into a performing arts center again. And so she worked with the Actors Equity Guild, and together they planned this huge performance to try to raise money for the Ford's Theater Society. Now, Becca and I always laughed that when we were writing this book and we were looking at all these places, anytime there was some kind of ceremony or opening, Helen Hayes was always there, with theater, really well-known theater performer, always there. And so after Abraham Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater, 100 years later, Helen Hayes took the stage for the very first time. And what I love about Frankie Hewitt's strategy of how do we bring the performing arts back, theater on stage in DC, she took the approach of television. She knew that in the 1960s that people were tuning into TV, right? So to ask people to come to the theater and, show up, yeah, people were doing that, but she knew she could reach more people through TV and through television. So she broadcasted Helen Hayes and she broadcasted all these really well-known names into the living rooms of folks across the country. And then right there and then they could donate money to help put this theater back into action. And I think that that's just such a special story. Now, talking about representation though, Frankie Hewitt does have this plaque at Ford's Theater. Very few people see it because it's on the wall that the doors open up out of the theater. So when you're leaving the theater, your back would be to it. And so if you don't turn around, at 10 o'clock at night after the show ends and look for it, you would totally miss it. But she has a name and her face is kind of engraved there. And she is remembered as someone that, was an advocate for the arts and for the humanities. And she wanted Ford's Theater to be not only performing arts, but a museum where folks could come back and learn, right, and engage with this space, as opposed to just letting it sit there as a kind of a negative place and a memorial to someone, to death and all that. So I love Ford's Theater.
I think I have to jump in because there is a woman who ties directly into this, in multiple ways, which is one, she also showed up at a lot of different things whenever we would be working on a chapter. Her name, especially kind of in the 60s and 70s, which a lot of this preservation work sort of occurs in, would come up. And she has a direct connection to Lincoln, and that's Nancy Hanks, who we talk about a lot. And she's become a little bit of a champion, I feel like, that we often are how do we get Nancy Hanks involved? So for the uninitiated, Nancy Hanks was the second chairwoman or the second chairperson, first woman to ever hold the position of the National Endowment of the Arts. So we're talking about somebody really committed to preserving arts opportunities all throughout the United States. One of her quotes was that our country was too big and too diverse and too interesting to have the best of anything. We had to have lots of bests all around the country. So she really was this wonderful advocate for the arts, but she was a very savvy politician, very savvy lobbyist. So when she becomes chairwoman of the National Endowment for the Arts, the budget's $9 million. And she's like, yeah, that's not going to work. And so during her over decade long tenure, she gets it quadrupled and then quadrupled again. So by the time she leaves, the budget's $200 million for the National Endowment for the Arts. So when we think about the explosion of kind of community arts, a lot of that is Nancy Hanks. But if you know a little bit about Lincoln, you know that Lincoln's mother was Nancy Hanks. And she is indeed a distant cousin to Lincoln's Nancy Hanks, and also a distant cousin to Tom Hanks, the very famous actor who is also cousin Nancy Hanks. So when you said Lincoln, I was like, I have to talk about Nancy Hanks. But I think
I
all
didn't
of
know
you,
that they were actually related. I just
yeah,
thought the name was a total coincidence.
no,
And Tom Hanks, get out. This is crazy.
it's crazy. Yeah. So she's uber connected. But a lot of people in DC don't realize that they probably, if they've ever driven through or walked through or spent time on Pennsylvania Avenue, seen a building that is technically named in her honor. And the reason people don't realize it is we don't call it the Nancy Hanks Center, which we should. Most people call it the old post office building, the old post office pavilion, or the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which is what it is right now. But if you've been on Pennsylvania Avenue, you know that beautiful Richardsonian Romanesque building with the big tower on the top. It was completed in 1899 to be the home of the US Post Office. And honestly, like a decade into its life, people were talking about tearing it down. This is a building that just kind of in every era, it's like, let's get rid of it, let's get rid of it. And frankly, the federal government never has the money to tear it down, so they never do. Like it was going to be torn down in the Depression, or like we don't have the money. It was going to be torn down when Pennsylvania Avenue is being revitalized in the 60s, and they're like, no, we don't have the money. But Nancy Hanks, when she becomes chairwoman of the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA is headquartered in that building, and she is going to really become the driving force in preserving it, making sure that not only is it never going to be torn down, but that it's going to remain in good care and good state, because it had not been particularly well cared for. And so this is going to be her effort. She's going to basically be the one woman show, just driving and driving and driving the preservation of that building. And in 1983, President Reagan actually signed legislation to name not just the entire structure, but all the surrounding plaza area in her honor. So it's the Nancy Hanks Center. And it has been for, almost 40 years. And yet you will almost never see it referred to that way in newspapers or any sort of media coverage of that building, which has been certainly in the news quite a bit over the last decade, as we've had the building changing hands, GSA renting it out to various hotels and such. And I'm really interested because there's a new effort to kind of revitalize Pennsylvania Avenue again. If you kind of do a little looking around online, you'll see there's a lot of proposals for what Pennsylvania Avenue could be, trying to make it more kind of community friendly, more bike friendly, more pedestrian friendly, make it better for the rallies, protests, marches that really fill Pennsylvania Avenue. And no matter what happens with that, I want one aspect of this revisioning to include truly calling it the Nancy Hanks Center. She has a really sort of tragic end of life story. She is going to get cancer. She dies when she's only 55. She's really quite young. But in such a short life, she had such an incredible impact. And I really enjoyed reading. This is going to sound so weird, but this was true about a lot of the book. I really enjoyed reading obituaries that were written around the time that she died, because they would describe her going into a room of senators and representatives and turning 100 no's into 150 yeses. Like she was that good. She could take 100 people against her and walk away with those 100 plus 50 more she picked up. She was just so savvy politically and so passionate about the cause. And so for me, that's an iconic part of DC's skyline, and it connects to Lincoln. That's my superpower. I can connect everything.
Connect everything to Lincoln. Yeah. And if you go up into the bell tower, there is recognition of Nancy Hanks. There's like a quote on the wall. So that's nice to see. And it's a beautiful view. If anyone is visiting DC, like you should definitely go up there and check it out. But yeah, we got to do a campaign to really get her recognized when
something outside, so when people see it. I will also mention one of the things that sparks her to really say, like, we got to get serious about saving this building is a 1,200-pound bell fell from the tower and went through like a floor in the late 50s. And she was like, this isn't good. I can't work in these conditions.
Yeah.
And was like, we got to do something.
So they named this the Nancy Hanks Center. And guess who was there at the ceremony?
Was it Helen Hayes?
It was Helen Hayes. Yeah. Don't you know it? Don't you know it? Nancy Hanks was also kind of a supportive, like, confidant or consultant for Wilhelmina Cole Holliday in starting the Women in the Arts Museum. So super iconic museum, women forward. And so Nancy Hanks really did, probably because she quadrupled her budget. So she definitely was a little bit involved in that. I'm not exactly sure to what extent, but we love that museum as well. All right. Gosh, so many stories to share. I would like to share one more story, and then maybe we'll open this up for questions. If you have questions, put them in the comments now. Otherwise, you're welcome to come on camera and chat with us and be a little bit more personal. So the one story I want to share is about Marjorie Merriweather Post, which, if you're from this region, you've kind of heard her name one way or another, but she's from the Post cereal empire. And then locally, she has a music venue named for her in Maryland, and she kind of pops up in interesting ways. But her house, her mansion, is what we call now Hillwood Estate. And I think that Hillwood Estate is just one of the most beautiful hidden gems in the city. Like, when it comes to historic homes, for me, it's like Dumbarton House and Hillwood. Love it. Like, there's gardens, you can walk through the house. They're just definitely worth a day out. I want to share this one sentence about Marjorie Merriweather Post. I think it just kind of sums up a whole bunch. And then I'll tell you about the preservation efforts. This is the end of our chapter. So Hillwood Estate is chapter 42. This is the very last paragraph. Marjorie Merriweather Post left her mark on the world in no uncertain terms. She was a suffragist, divorced 4 times, didn't drink alcohol, and threw the best parties in town. Big personality. She was a very savvy businesswoman. I mean, she's a CEO, and as we talked about earlier, she was a real estate mogul. Like, one of her, properties that people usually are familiar with is Mar-a-Lago down in Florida. She built this property, which then sort of got passed on as a winter estate for presidents and whatnot. But she spent a lot of time in DC. And when she built this mansion, which is right in the middle of Rock Creek Park, beautiful green area, she did it with the intent that, like, one day this is going to be a museum, and I'm going to share all my fortunes and all my riches with people to come in and look at it, and it's going to be great. And the mansion is really fascinating because, like, the kitchen is sort of 1950s, like bright pastel colors and kind of modern, but then the rest of the house has like old school Russian art in it. So there's a lot of different personalities, but it's amazing. So she built this museum, this house specifically in mind to be a museum. Not only a museum, Marjorie Merriweather Post was convinced that this would be the next Smithsonian. So when she dies, in her will, she leaves Hillwood Estate to the Smithsonian. Like, it is like mapped out. She knows exactly how it's going to go down. She like writes it off to the Smithsonian. And I call it the Lost Smithsonian because it never became that. When she left it to the Smithsonian, she didn't leave enough money for them to run it and have operations. Now, some people would say, like, oh, how could such a savvy businesswoman not leave it enough money? And like, what was she thinking? She did it on purpose. She did it on purpose because she thought that the Smithsonian would have to come in and ask her foundation and her children for more money. And then her children would be able to sort of negotiate for like spots on their board or like more involvement in it. Well, that never happened, unfortunately. It kind of backfired. And so the property did, in fact, just fall within the family's hands. And sure enough, now today we can go and visit it as a private museum, and it's because of her granddaughter. Her granddaughter, Ellen, I wrote it down here, sorry. Ellen Charles, I believe her name is. And she worked to preserve the house itself, to build a foundation, and to make sure that there were, the funds and everything that they needed to run Hillwood Estate. And as much as Marjorie Merriweather Post's story is front and center when you go there. There is a beautiful portrait of Ellen Charles there, and it's a reminder that this is intergenerational. You would think that preservation is kind of easy, but it was not easy. But like, if you have all the money and you have this mansion and like a plan, but it almost wasn't preserved. It almost was just lost. It could have been sold to, you know, a private residence or anything. So I love the stories of granddaughters and grandmothers really keeping their legacy strong. All right. Well, I think we're gonna close it up now and open this up for Q&A. Let me take a look at the chat box. No questions in here. All right. If anyone wants to come on camera, you're welcome to. I'll just take this time to officially thank Becca and Mary for chatting with us tonight. This is an important topic. I think the more you ask these kinds of questions, you'll realize how often women are sort of behind the scenes and keeping our history alive. And hopefully this encourages people to, you know, look for those opportunities as well. But yeah, I want to encourage anyone to hop on screen if you want to, and we'll hang on for a few more minutes. And if not, we just encourage you to have a great night. And we thank you so much for joining us.
Hey,
Becca,
everybody. I don't know if I'm the only person here from outside of Washington, but one question that kept coming to my mind as everyone was talking was, you know, you have these great projects going on that Tour of Her Own and Dumbarton House are involved in, and other groups around Washington, the end all and be all of historical monuments and this is why we visit Washington, right? And that's not the case in a lot of places around the country. So I'm wondering, you know, what kinds of things Washington groups could do to help other parts of the country scale up their recognition of women and people of color in public spaces, their preservation of historic sites, and, you know, even doing 101 Places book. So for their particular place. I mean, here in New York with Monumental Women, you know, we have a virtual walking tour of women's rights history sites, and we have our Talking Statues app in Central Park with our Women's Rights Pioneers Monument. And we're trying to work with other groups in Boston and really everywhere to help them do those kinds of things. It would be great if we had like an app that was common to all the different groups running tours or offering historic site information, you know, in their communities. And then you could just use the app and make it work.
We need a venture capitalist just to give us an email and we will get it going.
Well, what about Tom Hanks?
Tom Hanks, in honor of Nancy Hanks.
What his wife's name is, I forget Tom Hanks' wife's name, but she's, you know, she's pretty involved in their philanthropic efforts. So, I mean, that I'm just out there, but you know, there are people like that, other big bucks people who are committed. You know, we have the Pomeroy Foundation putting up signs around the country for women's suffrage.
Yeah,
that's a little limited.
I think there's a larger conversation about how we want to memorialize women's history or just history at large. Because when I think about DC, for instance, and I don't know, maybe Mary can talk to this, but like, we're such a diversity in terms of like nonprofit world, government and federal funding, and also small business. And I think it takes all of those things to to fund and operate these kinds of efforts. But then I think of places like Women in the Arts Museum or the National Women's History Museum, who have those kinds of backers and donors supporting them. And I think as we look forward in history, do we even want monuments and memorials anymore? Or do we want exhibits that are going to be able to be mobile across the country, or maybe different kinds of history? I just don't know, but I agree with you. Like, there should be some sort of centralized effort to bring this to other places. I don't know. I know DC, and I know that it's a city where you can get around and see these kinds of things. But we had this conversation recently with someone, I think from Chicago, and it was like, you can't really do walking tours in Chicago. Things are just too far spread out. And so I think you also have to think about the city and what the city needs to highlight front and center women and marginalized stories.
Yeah, we have the same problem with Staten Island. You can't get anywhere except in a car. But the one of the things about the app that we're using, and I'm not saying this to recommend it necessarily, but the app that we're using called Talking Statues, that literally has Viola Davis speaking as Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady, and Meryl Streep as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and in Spanish, Rita Moreno as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I mean, it's a way of teaching people about women's history, where, yes, we connected to a QR code that's in front of the monument, but you could stick a QR code anywhere, up on a little plaque, or you don't even need, you can listen to our Talking Statues app without even being at the monument. So you don't even have to be there physically. You can still access the content. So on our website. So that kind of thing doesn't require you to have a physical representation or even have a building there. But as people walk by, they could be pinged or whatever it is. And all of a sudden they're passing an area where, something important happened in women's history, and then they learn a little bit about it and they discover that whatever. But more content than you typically get on a sign.
There's definitely, I think, that conversation that we have to have outside of our own communities to bring it all together. I would agree. And the app, a lot of people are using apps and QR codes. That's very much common. Mary, Becca, any thoughts on this issue?
I would say get in touch with your local chapter of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America. We have societies in 43 states and DC, and I know that there's the Cortland House is one of the sites that they run in New York City. And these are women who have been working in preservation and telling stories for 133 years now. So I had to do the math really quick. So they're experienced in this, and they do their own fundraising, and they find ways to tell these stories and preserve these places, and that they can be a great resource to their communities. And that's part of why this federated structure is so wonderful, why we like it a lot, because it allows them to really respond to the needs of their individual communities and really make sure that they're speaking to the people who are there and doing the work that's needed in those spaces. And so check them out, because they're all doing awesome stuff.
Well, with all due respect, next to Washington, I would say New York City probably has more groups working on history than any other part of the country. The issue is, how do you, and everybody's going their own way. I mean, that's kind of the problem that I'm bringing up here, is that people do this, or they do something else, or they use Google something or another, or and for me, the important thing would be to get everybody sort of on the same page, so that it's universal and can be used wherever you go, however big or small you are. Just make it easy for folks to do.
It gets me thinking, about how women work in general. Like, if you think about the suffrage movement, it was you could make an argument that it was universal, but there were also like little coalitions that were working independently with different strategies, all toward the same goal, but getting there through different paths. And I wonder if that's the approach that we have to take in this situation, too many cooks in the kitchen kind of a thing. If everyone's trying to do the same thing, it could just not get done at all. Like you sort of freeze. So, and then women also do have our own communities and our smaller groups. I don't know where the cohesive element comes in. I can only think of like Women's History Museum and these larger institutions to support the work that kind of like grassroots advocates and historians are doing. I would also say too, it's like, we do a tour on pink collar jobs, and it's just like, this is a massive effort, and women often, because of whatever, like labor and all this stuff, can't travel, can't, spend the time doing this stuff. So we just sort of try to do what we can in our own circles. I'm not sure really what to say beyond that. I get the idea where you're coming from and I support it. I just don't know how, like, what that looks like.
You said exactly what I was going to say.
About what?
About this. You sort of hit on exactly what I was going to say.
Me and you, get out.
Yeah,
it's like we've been working together for
Get
like
out.
Yeah.
But these are important conversations.
Well, Brenda, can you enlighten us a little bit about how you got the monument in Central Park? Like how did that's a major accomplishment. And if you were able to do that, I would imagine that strategy stretches beyond New York and beyond Central Park.
Sure. For people who want to dive deeper into that, because it was a 7-year process, and we were initially told no way, and we went from there. And we had to raise close to $2 million to get it done. So
who did you raise your funds from, if you don't mind me asking? Was it private donors, or were you getting support from
it was
corporations?
It was a mix of things. It really was not very much. There was a little bit given by New York City government officials, very little. But a couple of women council members did support it.
Okay.
And $500,000 challenge grant was given by New York Life, which, as it turns out, had a very deep connection with the Susan B. Anthony's family.
Mm-hmm.
And trivia: Susan B. Anthony cashed in her life insurance policy, I'm sure to her dad and brother's chagrin, because they were agents for New York Life, in order to fund, I think it was the first women to attend law school up in Rochester. So they gave us $500,000 to start if we could match it, which we did. And that took us a long way towards things. And then other smaller amounts from family foundations and, personal connections and all kinds of things. The board a little bit, and but not from Central Park, not from the Central Park Conservancy. We actually wrote a best practices type of handbook to how to go about doing this, which is free on our website. In addition to showing the the process that we followed in order to get this done for other groups that are looking to replicate for a large thing. It's really turned out to be way more popular, let's say, than we could have imagined. Part of it is, what I really like, because I worked on both the monument and the talking statues aspect of it, is the fact that people can learn so much more about the history involved with the suffrage movement and women's rights movement and these three women than they could by reading a sign. So yeah, it turned out to be great, but it was really a struggle.
Yeah. There's this
You have to persist.
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
The motto for Women's History. There's a like an organization that's leading a women's suffrage memorial in DC. Are you at all involved with that? They've just started announcing.
Not me personally, but I think one of our board members is involved.
Okay.
With that. She hasn't
Yeah.
reported on that recently, so
It's
don't
that
know.
seems like a very ideal place to start connecting, you know, everybody's work,
Well,
pulling it center.
it would seem to make sense if they ever get a physical location for the National Women's History Museum, that they'd put that monument nearby or next to it.
They just
Not everything
selected the
makes
two
sense here.
sites.
Oh, wait,
are gonna
yes,
be-
that site, that's right, I saw an email about that. They selected two sites. One was for the women's monument and the other one was for,
The Museum of the American Latino.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the
I was
two
gonna say
museums,
a
but
fan-
we don't
yeah,
know
but-
which will be which yet. And
right.
And there's accessibility concerns, so adding a memorial or monument on top of the
Yeah,
museum itself.
I vote against the tidal basin. I think it's just gonna flood all the time, so.
Yep, that's my
they say
concern
the
as
tidal
well.
basin
Climate change.
So
There goes the Women's History Museum. Oop,
How
the ironies there.
yeah, exactly.
washed away.
All right. Well, I think I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Brenda, it was so lovely for you to join this program. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and all the work that you did. Like it's but we should have added you maybe into this. We'll do a New York version. But yeah, I don't know
Well,
if
we're not done. We've got, a plaque for Lorraine Hansberry coming up. We just unveiled a group
Right.
just unveiled a plaque for the equal suffrage. I'm missing the last word here. A group of African-American women that organized in Brooklyn. I mean, there's lots of stuff going on.
yeah.
New York City and all around New York State, actually. And in California and other stuff that we're involved in. So
Yeah, New York is so rich with women's history.
check us out. We're not one and done.
Is there anything that we can do for you from a tour of our own or Dumbarton or just being in DC? Any way we can help?
I'll think about that.
Okay.
Think about that.
Yeah, think about it and
Convince the second gentleman that this should be one of his initiatives.
done. I'm gonna head over there
He
right.
he was looking around, so he showed up at my friend's camp for women in the trade, girls, getting girls interested in being tradeswomen.
Oh,
And, so we made a pitch to him a little bit. We handed him a card, said, "Monumental women, you need to support more women and people of color in public spaces, second gentleman." So
I
we'll
think-
see where that goes.
yeah. I think that if we show up outside their house with some picket signs, but they're positive and they're not negative, maybe they'll appreciate it and like actually, hear us out.
Well, Hillary was our keynote at our unveiling in the midst of a pandemic, which actually turned out to be a little bit of a blessing in some respects.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think it, but it
Yeah.
forced, we got a lot of stuff done during a pandemic. It was amazing.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks
All right.
everybody for, letting me take up so much airspace here.
Love it. Yeah. Oh, you're always welcome. Please. We hope to see you at more events. So, all right. Mary, thank you so much. Becca, thank you. And everyone have a happy Halloween tomorrow. Don't eat too much candy.
Thank you so much, everybody.
All
Thanks,
right.
everyone.